Cassandra stood up. She clenched Ramses's reins as she looked around. She was standing on an obsidian mirror stage, framed with the rings of rune-inscribed tiles. A stairway led from the stage, through a small arcade, to a desolate ruin of towers that strained to scrape the sky. The iron hinges squeaked loudly as the large wooden door was pushed open. Cassandra clenched a dab of light, then pitched it into orbit around her. The tiny star lit her way. Shadows, tucked in every nook and crevice, leapt dizzyingly away from the light, and the details were carved out of the darkness. The halls of the floating castle Domara lay in utter disarray. Rubble was strewn across the floor. Cassandra stepped over the collapsed ceiling's megalithic vaults. Cracks riddled the walls, once dressed with tapestries. Winds whistled through the labyrinth of corridors and slipped under Cassandra's dress to lick the back of her knees. The resonation of the breezes and the creaking of the ancient wood teamed up against the princess's better senses to tickle her paranoia with their ghastly moans. It was no wonder this ruin from a forgotten era was believed to be haunted. Walking down the halls, she remembered the stories associated with the castle, its queen, and the various attempts made by her adversaries to wrestle away control of the floating island. The thought of possibly walking down the same hall where the great warrior Kite stalked the monster of 1,000 horrors sent her imagination into a feverish pitch. Time had developed such rich, romantic characters, and her young heart did not want to hear anything that might shatter the fragile truth of their existence. The castle was enough evidence for every story that she had ever heard. What was that? She bit her upper lip in fear and curiosity. A footstep? Perhaps Kite did not finish the job after all. Her imagination won her over. Curious pangs swallowed her. She was anxious to be at peace with what was around the corner. She turned down another smaller hallway, this one not as damaged as the others. There was a loud click of metal against stone, and Cassandra felt a tug on her foot as she moved to step forward. Her toe had snagged a loose floor tile, and the hall resounded with a yelp as she crashed to the floor. The star fell with her, shattered on impact, and was extinguished. Cassandra winced to fight through the throbbing pain in her ankle and elbows. She pulled herself up and slid the silk dress away. It was difficult to discern anything in the dark. She massaged her heel and ankle through the boot, but as far as she could tell, there was no bruise or twist. A glint of light on her gilded heel then distracted from her assessment. Cassandra pointed her toes to work the pain out, and studied how the speck of light glistened on her boot's golden brace. Light was coming from somewhere on the wall. She stood up and held her hand at her side. The scratch of light fell into her open palm. Slowly she walked forward and traced the beam to its source. Partially up the wall was a short but deep crack in the mortar. Cassandra crouched forward to look through the space, but all she could see was light. She pressed her gloved finger into the hole with the hope of scratching the crack open. Instead, the light penetrating the gash was blotted out by a thick, muddy mess. The mortar between the bricks was still soft and pliable. Astonished, Cassandra traced her finger through the seams. The mortar bunched and blotted against the stone's edge. She could easily reach enough of the pliable mortar to trace an arch in the wall. Curiosity pushed her to press against the bricks. The stone snarled as the segment framed in wet mortar submitted. The scraped floor tiles hissed painfully as the wall opened. Beams of light started to prod in from the passage beyond the wall. A short corridor of plain, pale stones opened into a tall, domed chamber. A beam of daylight rained in through a central oculus and illuminated the entire room. The beam fell into a cauldron, suspended by chains over a fire pit built into the stone floor. Beyond the light-catching cauldron, on the far side of the dome, was a tall cabinet with filigree carved panel doors. Cassandra circled the cauldron to the cupboard. She pulled the leather gloves off of her hands and peeled the panels open. The opening doors stretched apart cobwebs and wafted up a stale aroma. Shadows disguised the contents, and Cassandra's eyes needed some time to adjust to the darkness. On a writing slant in the cabinet sat a book, locked with a thin gold plate. An impression of a crescent-clasped pearl was stamped on the mechanism sealing the book. Cassandra wasted no time in opening her cloak. She pulled from her breast the necklace that matched the design and placed it in the embossed lock. The seal clicked open. A warm breath hissed against the back of Cassandra's ear as the leather cover heaved and released the pressure of the tightly bound pages. She traced the decaying binding with her fingers. It was uncomfortably coarse and dry. The hairs on her wrist anxiously stood on end. She was not sure if she wanted to open the book. It was in some sense too late, however. She had already unlocked it, and if something lay inside, then it was certainly already free. She traced the gilded ream with her finger and dug into the pages with her lacquered nail. The leather cover creaked as the contents of the book was unveiled. The pages glowed. Rays stretched from the parchment into a column of light. The script was scrawled like shadows out of the illumination. The saffron color, to which the pages had aged, shined on Cassandra's features. The glow did little to ease the paranoia that was building. The curiosity that drove her into the chamber and revealed the book to her was now matched with a voice that sibilated with the brushing pages. Her ears blushed from breathy gusts that passed. She could hear a gasp, a breath being taken in, but twisted by some audible element, almost a language, still being pressed out, as though someone were swallowing words. She was desperate to understand, felt overwhelmed by confusion. Was she drowning? She was breathless, blind, innocent to any knowledge of her environment. She could only sense what was tickling her ears. Something was there, was with her. She focused herself, attempted to concentrate on knowing what was going on. Hungry curiosity knotted tighter in her stomach. She felt that she was on the verge, at the edge of a wall or hedge, and searching to see what was on the other side. Every step she took to satiate the hunger seemed to slip out beneath her. She treaded uselessly at something. What was she doing? Was she reading? Her breath came back to her. The book's light was still in her eyes, but she could read the script. Spoke the Tawesh, Anut Orkan, dream this moment. Eyes are closed, yet they do not dream. Talmay answered, Orkan ne'if, the moments will not be. Isk abaham Anut, I will not endure these moments. I close my eyes to these dreams. Spoke the Tawesh, Deva Anut rekum vas anaba? Is it your place to interrupt the dream? Orkan sempi, waiting, you keep me waiting. Orkan esquish, the moment was gone. Wish esk rusti, the sequence begins. So spoke the Tawesh. Such was black magic. Black magic? Was it possible? The book was clapped shut. Cassandra held it against her chest as she ran out. Dark, moist dirt was kicked up by the black unicorn as it was urged on by his cloaked rider. Speckled patterns of green and brown danced all around as they raced through the Iman woods. Cassandra maneuvered her steed down the leaf-littered paths, relying on her memory to guide them through the various forks in the road. She wanted to get back to Castle Osmara. Her mother and Nesu would be in the stormiest of moods when she returned, but maybe she could distract them with the book. Then again, would it even be worth telling them? They would probably just take it from her. She wanted more time alone with it. Perhaps the book could help resolve the curse that marred the royal lineage. What was it doing in Castle Domara? Cassandra considered. It must have some significance if hiding it warranted such an effort. Why had the book been sealed in a secret chamber, hidden behind a false wall? How was it that she found it? The whole castle had been searched and cleaned of any salvageable remnants after the attacks almost 2 decades prior. It was a miracle that the tower even still stood. Was there some force that kept that chamber safe from the attack? Or discovery? She was flushed with regret at not having tested the perimeter for any type of magical defense. It would be embarrassing to admit that she had ignored her teacher's practical advice. Perhaps she should have settled to meet Nesu for her lesson today. Perhaps she should be more attentive. Bothering over the consequences now could not change her earlier rash behavior, however. It would accomplish nothing, and she was too busy for idle considerations. Besides, disclosing the book to Nesu or Osmara would betray the only retreat she had. She changed her focus to the contents of the book. If she could be left alone with the book, then maybe she could find some healthy distraction from the growing pressures of the castle. She needed to be alone with it. It wanted to be alone with her. The book seemed to seep suggestions alien to her innovation. The touch of the old, worn leather against her body made her skin writhe. The wind rifled through the pages like her curiosity flickered between topics. Her thoughts were spastic. She could not concentrate. She felt overwhelmed. Ignorance poured up around her. She was falling into it, and clung to the book as her only source of salvation. With a swell of vertigo lurching in her stomach, Cassandra began to question her sanity. Unanswered, her pointed ears perked at the sound of some distant thing's approach. She looked back to see shadows flicker between the trees' silhouettes. She could tell it was haunting from how it flanked her, surrounded her, kept pace with her. The branches were snapping ever louder beneath its tread. It approached, encroached on her. She did not dare ride to it. She pulled the reins, and Ramses trotted slower. Cassandra pressed the book tighter to her body. Maybe if she held it really close, she would be safe. It could keep her safe, just as it had protected the tower through the attack. A gauntlet pressed against her cloak. Cassandra yelped and pulled on the reins to turn and see what had molested her. Raising her hand to ward off whatever cold creature had grabbed at her had accidentally let the book slide from her embrace. Cassandra lurched oddly to pin the unlatched tome between her knee and elbow. Loose pieces of parchment rained down from under her cloak and fluttered to the forest floor. The rustling of the falling pages gave Cassandra nightmares. Ramses's stomped pivot treaded the papers into the mud. The paranoid voices from the pages wailed painfully in her mind. She could not stop the haunting sound. She could not escape, could not run. The offensive hand was now clasped tight around her flailing wrist. Everything was demanding her, pulling her, calling out for her. The pages were calling her name. "Cassandra!" Tarragon shouted. Cassandra caught her breath. Some essence of familiarity and safety in the sound freed her from drowning in the hysteria. Still shivering, Cassandra slowly opened her eyes. Tarragon lifted the visor on his sallet, his brow furrowed as he examined her. Recognizing him, she closed her eyes again and sighed with relief. "Cassandra, are you all right?" he asked. Cassandra looked guiltier by the moment as the remaining soldiers strode in. "I am..." Her eyes were wide with disbelief. She got confused at where she was and what was happening. She saw the pages littered under Ramses's hooves. "Oh no!" She threw her leg back over the steed and dropped to the forest floor. Ramses relented as Cassandra softly pushed him off to one side, and she fell to her knees and began to pluck the scrap parchments from the hoof prints. The pages were dirty, but salvageable. Tarragon shook his head in disbelief, then dismounted to join Cassandra in saving the displaced pages. "What are you doing here?" Tarragon inquired. "This is no place for the Princess of Hexen." Cassandra scowled. "Oh, and where do I belong?" She tested as she grabbed another page and attempted to revitalize it before replacing it in the tome. Tarragon accepted his failure to gauge the strength of his words. He was not going to answer that question. They shared an awkward moment wallowing in their guilt, snatching at lost pages, brushing off the dirt, and then replacing them in the book. "Are you all right?" Tarragon eventually asked. "I'm fine. You just startled me," Cassandra replied, contrite. She smoothed out the wrinkles and creases of another beige page between her thumb and knuckle. A spring breeze danced in her hair and displaced a pair of golden locks. Cassandra traced her brow and tucked the hairs behind her ear and used the moment to examine the blotchy brown script through squinted eyes. Suddenly her gaze shot up at the knights that had gathered on the trail. "What is it?" Tarragon asked, finally noticing that he was the only one still picking up the scattered papers. Cassandra's smile frightened him. She was planning something. Before he could open his mouth for another breath, Cassandra had crawled beside him and was forcing his intellectual submission through her hypnotic amethyst gaze. "No matter what happens, do not move," she whispered. Tarragon sighed and attempted to find comfort in her smile, despite knowing that it usually heralded trouble. Cassandra carefully watched the guards, analyzed them. The armored men and women sat bored on their unicorns and were succumbing to self-indulgent and sleepy preoccupations. Not one of them was watching her. As she picked up the last of the papers and tucked it into the book, she turned her gaze to the forest trail. The words that had been written on the examined page slipped from between her pink lips effortlessly. Tarakon's concern started to show as he heard her whisper something throaty and rhythmic. Something warm pressed against his cold, armored hand. Distracted, he looked down to see her delicate painted nails caress his fingers, then clutch his palm. He felt at ease. A shriek from one of the mounted soldiers drained all sense of boredom. Tarakon looked up. Dried twigs and decayed leaves rustled loudly, as though a breeze was tearing through them. Yet, as the sound clattered around them, they felt no gust. The sturdy trunks that lined the dirt path grew limp, lazy, warped as though seen through some screen of smoke and heat. Roots slithered erect and danced along the path. The rough, scabby bark peeled away from the trunks of the trees, pushed away by arachnid fingers and twig-thin arms. Fruits and nuts plummeted from the branches and smashed against the forest floor. Nutshells rattled to life as needle-thin legs pierced their seams and scraped and struggled to crawl forward like crabs. Diminutive and deformed sprites were birthed from the juice-seeping seams of the broken fruit skins. They whimpered and cried like frightened babies. Leaves whisked from the canopy, their skeletal veins peeled out of the blades to stalk forward on stem legs. With hive coordination, the spawning swarm of fairies focused their gaze on the squad. The inky depths of the fairies' eyes reflected the soldiers' horrified faces. Tarakon clenched his eyes, afraid to watch, but still could feel the beating of their wings against his face. The possible atrocities played in his mind. There was no chance to react. They had been waiting. It was an ambush. An extreme loneliness welled tears in his eyes as he heard the cries of his companions fade into the distance. They had retreated. They had abandoned him. His heart fought to keep beating as the rest of his body accepted and surrendered. Cassandra could feel Tarakon's hand trembling, and she squeezed it tighter to feed off of his growing fear. She left no sense unaltered. The air buzzed with the beating of illusory wings. Gusts wafted from their fluttering. The bitter scent of overturned dirt soiled the air. Tongues dried sour with fear. Cassandra bristled with excitement when the soldiers drew their swords. Their hissing blades were a sure sign that they were convinced. Cassandra let her imagination run wild. The fairies piled and swelled, crested, poured forward, splashed, and curled to cut Cassandra and Tarakon off from the rest of the squad. Through the yelping fairies, the desperate cries from the squad could be heard calling out to the captain and princess, but the two had been overwhelmed by an avalanche of forest fairies. "Come on!" Cassandra groaned as she pulled on Tarakon's arm. There was no biting, no scratching. Even the beating of wings had faded from his face. Tarakon slowly opened his winced eyes. He could look over his shoulder toward the voices fading in retreat. From behind, the mirage was simply the haze of hot air over a grill, a wavering distortion. His comrades were fleeing from nothing more than a curtain of smoke. Tarakon smiled, relieved of an enormous burden. Cassandra was already mounted and slipping the sealed book into her saddlebag. "I should have thought of this before," she mumbled to herself. She looked down from her saddle with an impatient glare at Tarakon. "Well, come on already. I do not know how long it'll last." She kicked the unicorn and tore down the woodland trail.